guys, so as you can tell by the title of the video, today I have decided to film my labor and delivery story. This is number 1, which is with my now almost 6-year-old son, Drew, and as you can also tell by the title, he was born via emergency C-section at the age of 14. Well, I was 14. This also ended in the fact that I can never attempt a VBAC, which is a vaginal birth after cesarean. I will always have to have C-sections with my children, and they really don't want you to go over 2. 3 is like pushing it, they'll do it, but after 4 they're like, okay, you're done, you need to stop. I've only had 2, thankfully. I don't have any more kids than that, but I will never be able to try a vaginal birth, which is upsetting, and it does suck because, you know, it's just something that your body's meant to do. Anyway, I will talk more about that later on into the video. So, like I said, I did have my son when I was 14. I got pregnant at 13 years old, which is insanely young, and I think I'm going to do a video talking about how I see that now as an adult, being so young and having a child, and now that I'm 20, just talking about it. If that's something you guys would be interested in, let me know. But, yeah, I did have my son when I was 14. The day that he was born, I went in for my 37-week checkup, so he is actually considered an early term baby. Apparently now some doctors are considering 37 weeks full term. When I tell doctors that I had my son at 37 weeks, he's considered early term. It's just something they have to keep an eye on type thing. So he was born at 37 weeks. I went in to my routine checkup at 37 weeks. It was basically the first time that they would check me to see if I was dilated or thinned out any, they would just measure baby, you know, measure belly, just things like that, just the routine checkups. And so I don't believe that I actually had slept that night. I think I stayed up like all night to make it to this appointment, which was at like 10:15 in the morning on September 4th of 2012. And so I go to this appointment, and they of course get a urine sample. They come in, they feel to make sure my uterus is basically at the same week that it should be, that he's measuring okay basically, and they check me for dilation. And I actually wasn't dilated. They said that it was like a little bit, like maybe he was doing like a tiny amount of something, but I was not in labor. I had not dilated. I was not thinning. Like, it was very tight still. Oh, that sounds bad. But yeah, there was nothing happening, which I kind of knew that because I had been cramping a little bit, but it wasn't anything insane. And I was only 37 weeks, so I didn't expect anything. I will say though, that hurt entirely way too bad for a 14-year-old. I feel like the doctor just like was trying to reach like my throat through my vagina, honestly, so that was painful. And then she's like, so we found some protein in your urine sample, which protein in your urine sample is protein in your urine. I really don't know. It's only supposed to be like a low level, not like a super high level, and mine was elevated. So she's like, so we're gonna do a catheter to see if it's just like basically vaginal discharge causing it to be higher. I'm like, I can't just go clean my vagina and do this again. Like, you have to put a catheter in. And she's like, no, we have to. This was really painful. There was like 3 people surrounding my no-no square, and I had my face covered with a shirt that I wore, and my mom was holding my hand, and I was just bawling my eyes out because it hurt so bad. Like, it wasn't just one person down there, it was like 3 people down there. I had one nurse with entirely 2 long nails, like spreading, by the way, this is kind of graphic, I am so sorry, spreading open my girl parts so she could get it into my urethra, and her nails were digging into my girl parts. And it was just a very, I don't want to say traumatizing, because obviously when you have a baby, and I made that decision for myself, so I knew that it had to happen, and I knew that there was no getting out of it, but it was terrible, you know what I mean? Like, it was just, it hurt really bad. Well, they do this, and she's like, well, your urine levels are still elevated, so you should probably go to the hospital. Like, and my BP was high, my blood pressure was really high. And I'm like, am I gonna have a baby today? And she's like, yeah, there's a really good chance. There's a really good chance. If not, then you'll be put off school until you do. And I'm like, okay, because I was a freshman in high school. So I stop at home, I get something to drink. I didn't eat. I don't even know if I grabbed bags, honestly, at this point. It's kind of all just crazy to me. And then I head out to the ER. They're like, do you need us to call an ambulance? So it was actually quite severe, but to me it was like, you know, it was I didn't know what was gonna happen. So I get into the ER, I check in, everything. They get me into the room, and there is another like catheter kit right there, and I'm like, what the fuck is this? Like, I just did this. And she's like, yeah, well, we have to do our own to make sure that like it didn't get like messed up by them or anything. And I'm like, you mean to tell me that I just had a catheter an hour ago and you're about to give me another one? She's like, yeah. And then this nurse goes on to explain that the catheters that the hospital uses and the catheters that my doctor uses are completely different, and they basically specialize in sticking things up your urethra because they do this daily, so it would be okay. And I'm like, love this day. So yeah, that's basically what happened. She decided to do another cath. They did another cath, and they took my blood pressure and everything, which was also elevated at this point. And we waited a little bit, and they're like, yeah, your protein's still really high. Then they come in. They don't tell me what they're doing. Mind you this. They don't tell you what they do. They just do it. And I hate this because I didn't know what they were doing. So they come in with needles and bags of IV fluid, and I'm like, what are you doing? And they're like, well, we're gonna start an IV. I'm like, does that mean I'm having my baby? What does this mean? She's like, we're just gonna get you some saline going and some I want to say, God, what was it called? Like, no, I think it was magnesium, maybe, I'm not for sure, but it was to basically help my blood pressure lower, because at this rate, she's like, so we're just gonna start, this magnesium or whatever to lower your blood pressure, because at this point, my blood pressure was 240 over 130, which is like insanely high. Blood pressure is supposed to be, I think, 120 over 80 for like an adult or whatever. I wasn't even really an adult, but anyway, that's supposed to be normal. 120 over 80 is, and I was 240 over 130. So they're like, yeah, kind of you should be dead right now. So we wait, and I think it was about 5 hours from the time of my appointment to like basically getting done with my appointment and going to the hospital and everything that he was born. So it wasn't a long wait, but it was still stressful. So the doctor comes in, and he's like, so I'm going to check you for dilation. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me? Why? Like, why do you need to check me? Like, these people have already checked me, you know what I mean? And then he's like, so, checks me, not dilated, not thin. And then he's like, so we're going to do a C-section. And I'm like, what? He's like, honey, your blood pressure is extremely elevated, which is probably causing baby to stress out, and we can't get it to lower, as well as your urine and your protein is extremely elevated, which means that you are preeclamptic, and if we don't take you to surgery now, you're both probably going to be dead in like the next few hours. And I'm like, you can't induce me? And he's like, we don't have time. Like, this is an emergency situation. We are prepping the room right now. Like, he's like, we have to get this done now. And I like start freaking out, and I'm like, oh my god. He's like, in about 15 minutes. And I'm like, my stomach's about to be cut open. This is crazy. Like, I'm 14 years old. I don't know how to prepare for this. I'm like, Mom. Yeah, it was just really crazy. We called some of my family members, and I'll insert some pictures of like after he was born, and I think I have some pictures of like me in recovery and things like that. But yeah, it was so crazy. So I go back there, and it is all very, very fast, because they decided that my blood pressure was not lowering, and if they didn't do this, we would just both be dead. So they wheel me back there, and they do the spinal. It's all very quick, and then literally within not even 5 minutes of me being on that table and getting the spinal and everything going, he was out and he was crying. And he was born at 5:23 p.m. on September 4th of 2012. He was 6 pounds, 14 ounces, and 20 inches long. So for a 37-week baby, he was pretty big, and if he would have been carried to term, which is 40 weeks, he would have been a chub. He would have been huge. 6'14" and 20 inches is actually kind of not small, but it's relatively small. But for a 37-weeker, it's quite big. So he probably would have been really big, but yeah, to this day, I am so thankful that they did things the way that they did, and that they basically did save us, because afterwards, everybody, you know, all of the nurses and doctors was like, you do realize that you should have been unconscious, seizing, basically just, you should not have been as okay as you were. And I'm like, so what does that mean? And they're like, well, basically, you're kind of like a miracle in a way. I wouldn't say that I'm a miracle, but I would say that as the religious person I am, I definitely feel like there was angels and God over me that day. My son and I should not be here today. At least one of us shouldn't be here today, and I am just so thankful for the doctor that I had that day, which ironically enough is also the doctor that delivered me when my mom had me. So if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be here. If it wasn't for the fast acting of everything that day, from 10:15 to 5:23, I think that's what time the appointment was. And it is just, it is so insane. Afterwards, things went really well. I had to be in recovery for an hour, and recovery was quite smooth. My mom came back, and then they wheeled little Drew back there. He had to stay in the nursery for a little bit longer because his temperature was fluctuating. They couldn't keep his temp up, but that he was absolutely perfect. I have the sweetest picture, if I can find it, and the editing won't cut it out super bad. I will insert it here. It is the sweetest picture ever. He is just next to me, like cuddled into my face. He was screaming until he touched me, and it was just absolutely amazing. I remember right after they pulled him out, I had started getting very, very, very tired and like just drained, and I couldn't breathe. And the anesthesiologist, I told him, and he was like, hold on just a second, and he gave me something, and it was like a miracle worker. I really don't know what it was, but yeah, it was, the whole staff was absolutely amazing for this experience. I will do my second part to this, which is my labor and delivery with my daughter, which didn't end in an emergency C-section, but it did end in me blacking out to literal death. And it was terrifying, and it was a very traumatizing experience for the second one. But I will say that being 14 and this being an emergency C-section in the type of crazy case that it was, it went very smooth, and I now have a healthy, almost 6-year-old. And I lived through it, and I lived through another one too. So yeah, that is the crazy story. Now, with me being preeclamptic is basically just an elevated blood pressure, excessive swelling, which I had talked about to my doctor a week prior to this when I had my 36-week checkup, that I had had really bad swelling, and she's like, oh, it's just because you're on your feet. And I'm like, I don't think so, and she ignored it. Told me at the next appointment, they told me that my urine was elevated the week before, but it wasn't enough to cause concern. So in a way, I guess I kind of do blame that doctor's office. Not blame because it wasn't their fault, but I feel like they should have taken further action than just throwing it off the table like it's no big deal. Because I feel like things could have been much smoother, and they could have had me go in like a couple of days later to check my protein in my urine and things like that, to just make sure it didn't elevate as high as it did in the 1-week period that almost ended in us losing our life. So I do feel like there could have been some things that were different, but in the end, my life is saved, and that is truly what matters to me. But like I was saying, with being preeclamptic, any future pregnancies I have, I am high risk, because there is always the risk of my blood pressure elevating like that, always the risk of the protein coming back, or having excessive protein, and just being preeclamptic again, which can happen. It would just cause another very bad scenario. So I do have high risk pregnancies, and I will always have to have cesareans, because if I was to attempt a VBAC, it could cause my body to go into stress, which would also, once again, up my blood pressure and cause a very bad scenario again. So, with all that being said, that is the labor and delivery of my now almost 6-year-old boy. It was a very crazy day. A lot of it is still a little bit of a blur to me. A lot of it is still a little bit crazy. Oh, not to mention that they had to put in another cath prior to surgery, so I had 3 caths that day. Love it, but it was very scary. And personally, if I could choose between a vaginal birth or cesarean, I would choose a vaginal birth any day. I would rather go through that and be healed in a few days to, you know, you don't actually heal fully, but I would rather go through that than not be able to walk for a full 24 hours, because they don't let you get up for 24 hours. At least they don't hear. I always hear stories, people are like, I was walking an hour after, and I'm like, proud of you. I don't know what you want me to say. I was numb, and then the second time I was in too much pain to even move. So yeah, if you guys are interested in part 2, that will be up eventually. It's not really part 2, it's just my second labor and delivery story. And then if I can find pictures, I will insert a bunch of pictures here of that day and my tiny little boy and things like that. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Comment down below what day your babies were born and their birth weight and how long they were. I love seeing that. I love seeing little babies. Link in the description will lead you to my Instagram. And yeah, I hope you have a terrific